All right, Shalom. I want to start out by giving our praise, honor, and glory due to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakakwadash. I'd like to give divine honors unto the apostles and the elders of the great millstone who I learned this truth from. And I'd like to say peace and salutations unto the hopefully elect. And today is Monday, June 13th, 2026, Missile Monday. And I have this article from The Atlantic. And it says Russia and America are rediscovering the limits of nuclear weapons. So I'm just going to go into this article and bring out a few scriptures. Lord willing, this lesson is how to find it straight to the point. And I'm not going to be able to read the whole thing because they want me to, get a subscription, but I'm just going to read what they have available. So it says, Henry Kissinger often said that nuclear arms are weapons in search of a doctrine. After the Cold War, some strategists have tried to figure out what exactly these weapons could buy them beyond deterrence. The answer, as it turns out, is nothing. Two wars taking place right now are cases in point. The ongoing American attacks on Iran and Russia's desperate campaign of atrocities in Ukraine have produced dramatic footage of two major powers taking on middleweight military opponents, inflicting grievous damage and yet failing to achieve their goals. Among other painful lessons, the Americans and the Russians are learning again that their impressive array of nuclear weapons does not offer them a victorious path out of such conflicts. Because again, they know that if one nuke is launched, they're all going to be launched, because that's what type of time, these different nations are on. They're on a no first use policy, meaning out of all of the current 9 nuclear armed nations, none of them are going to use their weapons first unless another nation fires upon them. They're just going to retaliate, so that's the only way that's going to happen. So continuing on, it says, Americans, since the end of the Cold War, haven't bothered to think much about nuclear weapons. Last spring, the Trump administration decided to default its 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, a report that is supposed to explain U.S. nuclear weapons policy to Congress and the American people, rather than issue an update. But a lot has changed in the last 10 years, including the eruption of 2 sizable wars. Moreover, the United States is in the process of spending nearly $1 trillion on modernizing its nuclear arms without anyone spelling out what the Pentagon will do with them. And what are they going to do with them? They're going to use them, That's what they're going to do, during the time of World War III. Because again, me personally, I'm not saying this fact because again, I'm not sure. But, I personally believe, America, they're going to get theirs off as well. Certain lands outside of America and the land of Israel, may get hit. And if they do, they'll be built back up, But as we know, the majority of these nukes that are on the earth today are going to hit, Babylon the Great, which is the land of America. So I'm just going to bring out a few scriptures, man. Just going to hit a couple main points, But I'm going to start with the book of Revelation, chapter 9 and verse 12. It says, one woe is past, and behold, there come 2 woes more hereafter. And right, that first woe being World War I, and it says what? There be 2 more woes, meaning there will be 2 more world wars that were going to take place, in the near future. Because World War I took place between 1915 to 1919, So let's jump to the book of Revelation, chapter 11 and verse 14. Slakia. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 14. It says, the second war is past, and behold, the third war cometh quickly. And right, the second war being World War II, which went on from 1939 to 1945. You know, so the first war is past, the second war is past, but what we can see that third war, which is World War III, is coming quickly. You know, with these different things that we see taking place, man. You know, these different nations putting their resources toward their militaries, you know, gearing up for a war because that's the type, that's the type that we're in. Excuse me, Slovakia. You know, because that's the time that we're in. We're in a time of war, you know, and this is why you're seeing these different wars take place. Again, just like I mentioned in that article, you know, Russia and Ukraine are still at war. You know, the US and Iran are still at it. You know, used to have the little hats, you know, bombing, you know, Palestine, you know, China and Taiwan. You know, you have these various nations and countries that are at war with each other, you know. But what we can see is that third world is coming very quickly. But we know that World War III will not take place until Revelation, the 13th chapter, verse 16 down to 18, where it speaks of the mark of the beast, which the mark of the beast is the RFID microchip, you know, comes to pass. Until that prophecy comes to pass and that chip is made mandatory, you know, this war won't take place. But what we can still see the build up to it, you know, because with the New START treaty expiring, or that has expired, you know, this past February, you know, there are now no limits on, you know, nuclear weapons. So now there's gonna, you know, be another arms race that is gonna take place, because as I mentioned, that America is, you know, modernizing its nuclear weapons, while you have countries like, you know, Russia, China, North Korea, you know, upping their nuclear arsenal and developing more weapons, you know. So let's jump to the book of Isaiah chapter 9. Well, yeah, I mentioned it. Actually, Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 5. It says, for every battle of the warrior is with confused noise, and garments rolled in blood. But this shall be with burning and fuel of fire and right. You know, this coming world war isn't going to be like how traditional warfare was fought, you know, with hand-to-hand combat, you know, men having different weapons of war, you know, because ancient, you know, warfare, you would have one nation of men on one side of the battlefield, you know, coming up against another nation of men on the other side. And then what? They charging each other, you know, in the center, you know, meeting each other in the center until one nation is left standing, you know, that guerrilla warfare, you know. And as I always make mention, you will have ground troops that are going to be going to war with each other, you know, but this war is primarily going to be fought with those nuclear missiles that are on the earth today. You know, that's going to be their purpose, to end, you know, all wars. You know, hence the reason why World War III is nicknamed, you know, the war to end all wars, you know, because there's not going to be any more war after this. This is why these weapons are on the earth, you know, which have the literal capability of destroying the planet Earth. But as we know, or should know, you know, that it says in the scriptures that the earth abides forever. You know, so the entire planet Earth won't be destroyed, but certain lands will. We know for sure Babylon the Great, America is going to be destroyed. The land of Israel is going to be destroyed, but it will be built back up. You know, and again, I personally believe, you know, other lands may get hit as well. You know, obviously the entire earth is going to burn, but, you know, certain lands will. So let's get the book of Isaiah chapter 54 and verse 16. It says, behold, I have created the smith that bloweth the coals and the fire, and that bringeth forth an instrument for his work. And I have created the waster to destroy. And right, you know, the smith being these scientists and physicists that are behind creating and developing these nuclear weapons. You know, a primary example of this would be Julius Robert Oppenheimer, you know, who was deemed the father of the atomic bomb. You know, he would be an example of a smith, a modern day smith, because what does a blacksmith do? You know, they create, you know, weapons. and not just any weapons of war. And that's what these scientists are doing. They're creating weapons of war, but not just any old weapons of war, weapons of mass destruction. Because again, these nukes have the capability of literally destroying the entire planet Earth. But we know that that won't happen, you know. And the instrument for his work, the waster to destroy, being the nuclear missiles, in particular the warhead, because that's the part of the missile that does the damage, man, you know. And we can clearly see that, these nations are getting ready, to come up against this place very soon, because they're going to, even America's allies are going to come up against this place, pursuant to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 16, man, you know. So let's get the book of Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 3. It says, "For out of the north there cometh up a nation against her, which shall make her land desolate, and none shall dwell there. It's like, and none shall dwell therein. They shall remove, they shall depart, both man and beast." And right, and that out of the north is talking about, Russia, because again, Russia is that, the Northern Army, if I'm not mistaken, because I don't want to get mixed up with the North Country, but again, that's the North that is talking about, man, that's that nation that's going to come out of the North to come up against America, Russia, and it says what is going to make her land desolate. Russia is going to destroy America. On a small scale, we know, again, or should know, that Russia is going to destroy America. But we know that on a much grander scale, our Lord Yahweh Shai, along with, the angels, are going to destroy America, going to destroy Babylon, but that is the nation that is going to take America down. Because again, you have to remember that those Russians are Edomites, that are going to come up against the American Edomites and destroy them. So Esau is really taking himself out, but simultaneously being taken out by the Lord, So let's grab a couple more and it'll be it. But let's get the book of Malachi chapter 4 and verse 1. And it says, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch." And again, the day that cometh that is going to burn like an oven is World War III, because these nukes are going to burn extremely hot. They say the sun at its core burns at about, 15 million degrees Celsius, and that's extremely hot, right? But once these nukes detonate, man, at their core, they're going to burn at 100 million degrees Celsius, man. Just like it mentions that fervent heat, in 2 Peter chapter 3, that's what it's describing, man, that extreme heat that is going to melt the elements, man. These nukes are literally going to burn hotter than the sun, which is why America is going to burn for a long time, pursuing to Isaiah, the 34th chapter, which gives a vivid description of how America is going to look after that destruction, once that fire finally dies down, because this place is going to burn for a while, man, because again, you have to remember that America does have, its own oil, oil is flammable. Then not to mention, all of these gas stations and other things here, that are going to add to that fire, this place is going to burn for a very, very long time, and this is what we're patiently waiting for this place to be taken down, man. This is the spirit that us, hopefully elect men, and women are in, man, but primarily the men. This is the spirit that we're in. We're praying that the Lord comes back soon and destroys this place and delivers us out of here, So I'm going to end it with this. This is the book of Revelation, chapter 9 and verse 15. It says, "And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men." And right when you read in Revelation, the 7th chapter, it mentions the four angels, which these are four literal angels holding back the four winds, which the four winds are the destruction, that is going to take place on the earth, World War III, if you will, because there is a set time when it's going to take place, which is why it says there is a particular hour, day, month, and year, when this is all going to unfold, man, because again, the Heavenly Father has it set to when, this is finally going to take place, which is, soon we can see it, time things, these current events through, the scriptures. And it says what? To slay the third part of men, because you have three classes of men on the earth. You have the sons of God, which today are the biblical Israelites, so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, from the tribe of Judah all the way down to the tribe of Issachar. You have the sons of men, which are the different heathen nations. And then you have the sons of the wicked, which are you Edomites, you so-called white people. You're the third part of men. You are the wicked. This coming destruction is for you, Edom, But 2/3 of the nation of Israel, they're going to get caught up in this destruction. Pursuant to Zechariah 13:8, they're going to be cut off and die, And then you heathen nations, you're just collateral damage, You're just over here to make a little money and be destroyed, But that's primarily who this coming destruction is for the nation of Edom, But wicked Israelites and you other heathens are going to get caught up in it as well, So, Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory due to Yahweh, Baha Hashem, Yahweh Shai, Baha Hashem, Rakah Kodash. I'd like to give double honors unto the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, who I learned this truth from, and I'd like to say peace and salutations unto the hopefully elect. Till next time I say, Shalom.